All right, friends, we're gonna go ahead and get started here. Oh, I love how close together we are. And you know, kind of with the wood paneling and everything, it's just like a family reunion, isn't it? All we need is a fire in the fireplace. We'll try to have that next week. We could have had one today. Well, I wanted to introduce to you a friend, and I'm going to have a formal introduction and then an informal one. Formal introduction here is Dr. Chauncey Diego Francisco Andy. Is assistant professor of religion and humanities at Reed College, right across the street. As a Chicano scholar of the Hebrew Bible, Chauncey's work focuses on the intersection of race and racialization, theories of ethnicity, Latinx theorization of identity, and the reception of history of the Hebrew Bible. He earned his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary and has an MA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and is an ordained teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. So Chauncey, I got to know Chauncey. Yeah, you can stand up here because I was talking about how I look up to you, figuratively and literally. And I love that. I love that about Chauncey. And about what, 4 years ago, 5 years ago?
You moved here in 23 years ago.
3 years.
It feels like an eternity, but I'm just.
But I heard about you almost a year before.
Oh yeah,
because we have a mutual friend, Adam Baker, who is a minister in St. Louis, Missouri. Lovely friend that I've known a long time. He said, "Hey, one of my classmates is moving to teach at Reed College. Your meeting house is around there, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it's across the street." And so Chauncey and I heard about one another through a mutual friend, and then we connected, and you know, kind of the friendship just kind of takes off. So every time we're together, we take a selfie together, and then send it to Adam and say, the story of our friendship continues. So we're going to do this with all of you in the background too, and send your friend to Adam. Awesome. Introduce to you my lovely friend, Chauncey.
Thank you. Mark. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Some of you may remember my last presentation with y'all in your forum, and perhaps are ruining the day I stepped into your presence. But yet again, here I am to draw you into a conversation about uncomfortable topics, which seems to be somewhat of my lot in life. I don't mind. So today, the focus of this talk is going to be essentially, what do we mean when we say Israel and Israel-Palestine? And there are a lot of ways one could have gone with this presentation, but I think one of the things I wanted to offer to y'all in the process of this conversation is the idea that Israel is not a fixed term. I think we in many of our circles throw around the word Israel very often. And I think that what ends up happening is we've got a lot of Israel in the back of our mind that we don't necessarily spell out very clearly. So just to get us going, can you next slide, please? Thank you. If you push do this guy down here, then you can just tap over here. Over here.
Yeah, it's a little glitchy.
Okay, well, so you can still see this. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Anyway, so the plan for today, we're going to be starting with some key terms because I think it's just helpful to get us going. Then we'll be talking about the concept of Israel in antiquity, and then we'll be talking about Israel in modernity, to say kind of a post 1492 sort of reality, and then we'll move on to Q&A. Now, one of the things to say up front is that all of this is unavoidably overview in a way that's not totally fair to the material. We're covering functionally, if I'm being like, what, 3,500 years in the space of a half hour. So if this seems like, how are we supposed to take any of this in? The Q&A, I'm happy to backfill, ask questions. but just to know, I'm aware of the somewhat gymnastics floor routine vibe I'm about to do. And so anyway, onwards. Next slide, please. No, that's all right. Oh, no, too far.
Yep, sorry, you didn't need to go so far.
Just that one. Good. So let's start with some key terms. And note that I have here Israel's in the plural. So when we're talking about Israel, I think it's important for us to distinguish between which Israel we are talking about. So here are some of I have 8, just to prepare yourselves. So term 1, Israel in a kind of unclarified fashion. I define this as an ambiguous term of discourse related to communities that receive biblical texts. So in general, there's a conversation in biblical scholarship, Christian theology, Jewish theology about this kind of floaty Israel, and usually kind of identified in terms of the community that's either behind or a continuation of the community offered in biblical text. But it's essentially, I'm arguing, a term of discourse. This is like a term people are arguing about, deploying in various senses. Then we have ancient Israel. Note, yet again, an ambiguous term. And this is relating to communal identification of the communities responsible for the production of the biblical texts as they develop through time. So this is probably, for most people, in reference to the community prior to the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. For those of you who recall or don't, the Babylonian Empire rolls into Jerusalem, flattens it to the ground, exiles the vast majority of the wealthy, the literary elite, the people who have anything to kind of offer in a kind of a imperial sense, and then they deport them all back to Babylon. Now, when these communities return, as we find in post-exilic biblical literature, we start to find the word Jews appear. Now, previous to this, there wasn't really the same emphasis. We're talking about Israelites or Judahites, and all of a sudden now we have Jews, which is corresponding to these kind of imperial precincts, these imperial provinces that then you kind of get mapped onto this community en masse. Okay, so 2 Israels. 3rd Israel, biblical Israel. This is essentially to say the portrayal of Israel in the Bible. When the Bible says Israel, as it does many times, this is communicating a variety of things. Now, there's not one version of this. So you can think about this as an umbrella term, like, and I've got this up here, but in the way you say Hispanic or Latino, being Chicano, it's something I feel comfortable talking about. But when you say Hispanic or Latino, you're covering a wide array of possible communal identification. So you could be talking about Puerto Ricans, you're talking about folks with Mexican ancestry, folks with Cuban ancestry, the list goes on. None of these people are the same as one another, but we have this big umbrella term that manages to encapsulate all of them. And I think this is a helpful way for us to conceptualize biblical Israel, which is to say, Deuteronomy's Israel, channeled through the voice of Moses on the plains of Moab as the community is about to enter into the promised land, is very different than Exodus's Israel, which is to say Mount Sinai, Moses, tablets, so on and so forth. Why do I say this? On the one hand, the literature is just different. These are different emphases, different stories told different ways. And secondarily, the legal material is substantively different between those texts. Exodus has its own law code, Deuteronomy has its different one, and you can't really square them tightly. Now, this is what centuries of rabbinic interpretation has been attempting to do, kind of weave a sort of narrative through these very diffuse textual realities. But it is all this is to say these are not fundamentally the same portrait of Israel. If you like, you can think of biblical Israel as like the National Gallery or something, but all portraits about the same thing. So Deuteronomy's portrait is next to Exodus's portrait, which is next to Ezra and Nehemiah's portrait, and so on and so forth. Next, Israel is the state of Israel. This is a modern nation state beginning in 1948. And I separate this out because I think it's fundamentally important that we separate this from these other categories. Now, people have and will, and we'll get to this, connect the state of Israel to these categories, but that is an interpretive move. It is not a one-to-one requirement, and nor should it be, that the state of Israel maps tightly on sort of any of these pre-existing theological and or biblical portrayals of ancient Israel. So again, modern nation state, 1948. I differentiate that from these other Israels. Next slide, please. Great. So now four more. We have a kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, lasting until 720 or so BCE, when the Assyrians destroy that. Note that 586, the kingdom of Judah is destroyed. 720, the kingdom of Israel is destroyed. So this is lasting. We're kind of like talking about starting the 10th century BCE. So like a kingdom of some 300 to 400 years. But no, this is the kingdom that we know referred to as Israel. And I'll get into this later, but this is one of two. The next Israel is New Israel, and this is a Christian supersessionist use of the word Israel, which is to say the church is the new Israel, insofar as it has replaced Jews as God's chosen people. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but Christians surely believe in a Jewish Messiah, so how does this make any sense? You're right, it doesn't. This is a highly problematic term, but nonetheless, one that is relevant to our conversation. Yeah.
Can you unpack the term supersession?
Yeah, no, I mean, so supersessionism essentially is this idea, right? That God has in some sense phased out Jews and Judaism and applied Christian church over top of it. So it's essentially that the covenant that God made with Jews on Sinai with Moses and so on is rendered irrelevant by the nature of Christ's intercession with Gentiles, right? So the church, meaning Gentiles, non-Jews, have received the proper revelation and are carrying the ball forward where Jews dropped it. Does that make sense? No, I'm fine. That's all.
The people, the areas of scripture that portray a supersessionist vision.
Yeah.
Are these Jews writing?
Yeah, good. That's an incredibly important clarification. 99% of biblical authors were Jews. So, I mean, maybe we can talk about like 2 Timothy. You could make a semi-convincing argument about the book of Luke, but the vast majority of texts in New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, are written by Jews. So the idea that there is a non-Jewish conception of Jesus that's then superseding kind of these differentiated Jewish perspectives is a contradiction in terms. This is an intra-Jewish dialogue taking place in the New Testament. And so it's crucial for us to understand that Christian supersessionism, in some sense, starts developing very early in kind of Christian theological discourse in the 2nd century CE. We start to see this happening. All the Jews have dropped the ball, the Jews have failed. Here we are receiving the light of God's revelation through Christ, this sort of thing. Again, totally in face of the fact that Christians, while they're making these arguments, are talking about Jewish Messiah who has fulfilled the covenant on behalf of all people. You know, these things can't really effectively go together. It's like oil and water. But the argument is that this makes sense, though perhaps it does not. So the third point, I guess it's technically we're on 7, the land of Israel. Now, this is the land of Israel. The land is still, if you modern Hebrew who spend time in Israel, they'll talk about the state of Israel. But the state of Israel, they'll talk about haaretz in reference to the nation state, in reference to the land. The land of Israel throughout biblical texts and kind of general conversation is a theological and ideological construction of the boundaries of the promised land corresponding to biblical text. Why do I say it's construction? Because there are many ways of adjudicating the boundaries of said land across biblical texts. Back to my original, one of my biblical Israel bits. There are various portraits of the land presented in different texts in different ways. So this is helpful to think about. When we say the land of Israel today, are we referring to the boundaries of the nation state? The state of Israel, starting in 1948? Are we referring to the ever expanding boundaries of that nation state, encroaching on territory that was promised to Palestinians in 1948? Are we talking about one particular iteration of biblical texts, portrayals of the boundaries of said land, so on and so forth? Last Israel is Greater Israel. Now, this is a contemporary ideology that is stemming from Jewish extremist movements. Note, and we'll talk about this more at length, but the Israeli Secretary National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir is a proponent of this vision, essentially that the boundaries of the state of Israel should be as expansively considered as possible. If you see a map, I should have that. If you see a map of this, I mean, this is kind of all the way from the Mediterranean Sea through Syria into Jordan. I mean, it's this really kind of imperially expansive vision of what the state of Israel should be. Now, this is kind of taking, so to speak, a milkshake of biblical passages relating to borders and expanding out. Okay, next slide. So those are our Israels. Now we need to talk about Zionism, because there are at least two. So on the one hand, I define Zionism, I say political Zionism throughout the slides, but I think Zionism by itself, I'm talking about ethno-nationalist ideological constructions that correspond to Jewish self-determination. So there are a lot of ways that this plays out, but we can talk about the Jewish nation state, we can talk about a homeland, but this loosely corresponds to some of the historical boundaries, so to speak, of the land. You can start to see the kind of referential nature of the presentation at this point. And then we have Christian Zionism, which notably starts before Jewish Zionism, 17th century CE. We have Christians making the argument that Jews belong in the land of Israel. Now, why do they belong? We've got a lot of different possibilities. There's kind of the modern day political view, which is like the United States. It's very convenient to have an outpost of the West on the border of these kind of Middle Eastern nations. There's the eschatological way of framing it, a lot of evangelical communities today, which is to say, if we get all of the Jews into the land, then the Messiah will come back. Tricked Jesus into coming back early. So I think there are a lot of these things playing out, and reasons for Christian Zionism are diffuse. To talk about one Christian Zionism is totally helpful. But to get these two up here to see that they are necessarily interrelated, if only by the fact that Christian Zionism, at least in the first kind of iteration that I'm familiar with, if you're interested in my book, my friend Robert Owen Smith's book, Dearer Than Thine Own Salvation, is talking about Christian, before the kind of foundation of Christian Zionism. Anyway, the fact that Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism from about 300 years suggests that there is some kind of buy-in in Christian Zionists for this kind of burgeoning Jewish Zionist project that starts in the tail end of the 19th century. Okay, next slide, please. So having said all of these kind of terms, just to get those things out of there, you know, get it all up on the wall. We're going to start with Israel and antiquity. So key point here, any conversation about the past is inherently a representation of the past, right? History is not the same as things that take place in space and time. History is the representation of things that take place in space and time channeled through power dynamics. So essentially, not, as Keith Jenkins puts it, not history, we're not asking the question, what is history? We're asking the question, who is history for? That we don't tell a story about the past with no particular ideological agenda. And that could be this story, the case of my presentation, or any other portrayal of the things I'm about to talk about. There's no view from nowhere, if you will. So, what we are doing here, and talking about Israel antiquity, is constructing a series. We're charting a course. We are connecting dots that don't have internal consistency. Next slide, please. So, okay, Israel antiquity. The earliest extra-biblical material is from 1207 BCE, more or less, from Pharaoh Merneptah's stele, which is a kind of a monumental sort of structure, kind of tablet that was built. And we have here the line, Israel is laid waste, bare of seed. Okay, so this is say the Pharaoh led some kind of military campaign against a community known as Israel, and they lost. At the same time, some of the earliest biblical prose regarding Israel is from the 12th century BCE, so we're kind of around this time. Parts of Judges, perhaps a Psalm or two. But what this suggests is that we don't really know all that much about the kind of pre-biblical Israel. It does exist, we've got a name for it, we've got reference to it, but we have nothing that really fills it in effectively for us. We have no kind of corroborating evidence. Next slide, please. So then, let's talk about Israel in the Bible. So just some key points. On the one hand, we don't have archaeological data for an Exodus. So we've got this kind of starting movement in the biblical narrative with respect to the Israelites. Again, note the words here, Israelites, leaving Egypt on their way to the Promised Land. We don't have anything suggesting that. The movement of people that takes place in the book of Exodus is quite expansive. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Such movement would leave marks that archaeologists can find. However, we don't have any of it. But what we do have is a corresponding period of 400 years of Egyptian occupation of the land of Canaan, which is to say what's talked about as the land of Israel. So we can frame Exodus in this way, that there's not really an Exodus that gives rise to this Israel, but there is a communal memory of Egyptian occupation that kind of functions in an analogous way. So, next point. Archaeological evidence suggests a gradual increase in populations around Jerusalem. What we see over time is that population centers in and around Jerusalem are gradually populated. So we're not seeing like a sweeping conquest. Archaeologists are very clear about these things they call burn layers, which is to say when the city gets burned to the ground, you can find it. And you can kind of sift through various layers of earth until you find, oh, this was destroyed in this period, and then you can compare pieces of pottery and other things to kind of construct when this might have happened. Essentially, we don't have a conquest as the book of Joshua suggests. You were here for my last time, I probably problematized the book of Joshua for you, but let's just say Joshua is a self-defeating narrative of conquest. It is not the golden age of Israelite conquest in the way that many people understand it. So this is to say that these two foundational stories concerning biblical Israel are ideological constructions, right? These are not representative by things in space and time. Next slide, please. So, additionally, we have inhabitants of ancient Israelites, so up until 586 BCE, and then ancient Jews afterwards in and around the land until today, right? So there is a continuity of people being there, of Jews and or Israelites being there. They have never not been. At the same time, what we don't have is an archaeological data for a united monarch. We just, like David Solomon, we don't have, there's no there for us to chase down. Basically, from the moment we have relevant data to speak of, there are two kingdoms. There's Israel and there's Judah. One could, like they speak a similar language, people could talk to each other. There's an argument that biblical authors make for a united monarchy, but we just have nothing corresponding to that. And I think arguments from silence are quite dangerous, and biblical texts are not, so we say, free of artistic license when it comes to constructing the realities that they portray. So I'm going to argue that there is no extant historical period of Israelite rule or the entirety of the land that corresponds to biblical narratives. There's only two kingdoms, because that's all we functionally have to argue from. Next slide, please. Okay, essentially, ancient Israel cannot and does not map onto biblical narratives. It's a theological construction. It's an argument. Next slide. So now we just start skipping through time. So brace yourselves. By the 5th century, Jewish communities have spread across much of the world. This is 5th century CE. So we're like 1,000 years in the future from where we just left off a second ago. And we have Christians running the Roman Empire, and then we have the presentation of Israel kind of taking on new forms. Again, Christian supersessionism starts quite early, so Christians considering themselves to be the new Israel, and the Jewish communities referring to Israel in the sense of, no, we're Israel. Christians like, no, we're Israel, so on and so forth. The difference here is that Christians have the power in this dynamic through time. So over the course of the next 1,000 years or so, we have rising anti-Semitism in Europe, which again, Europe and nobody called it Europe then, but we just so we know where we're talking about. Rising anti-Semitism resulting in pogroms and ghettos, which is to say Jews being forced to live in particular places, and anti-Semitic laws. Next slide. Now, this continues until the 19th century. I mean, it's not like an easily defined slope, but let's just say things are bad in various ways and slightly better in other places. But I mean, it's kind of this amorphous blob of unpleasantness until the 19th century, when Jews in Europe experienced what we would talk about as emancipation. This is what generally what's called in the literature, which is to say Jews are allowed to have citizenship in European ethnostates. So Jews can be French, Jews can be British, so on and so forth. If this is surprising, it should be, because this is new at this point. Prior to this, Jews are not allowed to actively participate in these European societies. They're held in marginal roles, not able to own land, so on and so forth. Now that they're now able to serve in the military, they're afforded social privileges to worship freely. It's part of their life now that they can be French first and a Jew second, right? So there's this kind of channeling of European nationalism that kind of merges in and through 19th century Judaism. Now it's not like magically in 1801 Jews get all these benefits from society. But it's taking place over this 100 years. So like by the end of the 19th century, late 1800s, this is kind of sunk in. And that kind of carries on. However, anti-Semitism doesn't really go anywhere. Next slide. So following the Dreyfus Affair, which is to say, there is a Jewish military officer in 1890 or 95 that is a French Jewish military officer accused of treason, accused of espionage. He's then jailed, then exonerated, and in the process of being exonerated, it comes to the fore that the entire trial has been cooked up. This is all anti-Semitic nonsense directed at this person who didn't actually do any of the things that they said he did. In response to this, in 1896, Theodor Herzl publishes The Jewish State, which is his book, and dies shortly thereafter, and he's arguing that Jews need a land too. The 19th century is this time of ethno-nation states, right? Germany, as we know it, forms in the 19th century. Italy, as we know it, forms in the 19th century. I mean, not totally one-to-one, but at least we're talking about consolidation of land, consolidation of these ethno-nationalist identities that are playing out. And Herzl makes the argument that Jews too, being European, should have this possibility. And significantly, because Europe cannot offer Jews a safe place to be incorporated into these existing ethno-nationalist relationships, which is to say, the subpoint that European Christians can't imagine Jews as a part of them. Next slide, please. So Herzl's inspiring this movement that I talked about earlier, so political Zionism, which is to say, the idea that there is a Jewish return to what is then Palestine. Now, the name Palestine is thrown around a lot. From the Roman period on, the kind of stretch of land that we would, that I talked about earlier is the land or the land of Israel, it becomes called Palestine. So we're talking about a place that's been called Palestine for quite some time. So the debate about nomenclature, I think, is kind of fraught, and I think unnecessarily so, because everyone has opinions about what it should be. Anyway, at the time, it's very clearly on maps called Ottoman Palestine. Anyway, so this part of the idea of political Zionism is based on the myth of an empty land, right? These political Zionists in the early 19th century will talk about a land without a people, for a people without a land. The idea that there's no one there. There are no Jews there. We need to return. Again, back to what I said earlier, Jews are still there. They have not stopped being there. There are Jews in Jerusalem at this point. Now, Theodor Herzl doesn't like them. We'll get to that in a minute. But nonetheless, this process begins. We have the first Zionist Congress in 1897, where Jews in Europe get together, probably some from the United States as well, get together and talk about where we can go, where we should decide to point ourselves towards in terms of a homeland. Now, so following this Congress, waves of Jewish immigrants start to move to Ottoman Palestine. Again, like I said, Jews have been there the whole time, and there have been a whole lot of other people living there too, who often don't get mentioned, but Palestinians, for instance, there have been people who have lived there arguably just as long, I mean, let's say within several hundred years of Jews who have lived next to the temple. So like, who's been there longest is kind of a fraud, a red herring sort of question. Then, so at the same time, a reminder, Christian Zionists, having kind of come onto the scene in the 17th century CE, are pretty jazzed about this. This fits into their imagination of what needs to happen. This Christian Zionist movement is not new, and it is certainly capitalizing on the things that Jewish political Zionism is advocating for. Next slide, please. So some things to know. Jewish Zionism is not one thing. So we've got statists, which is to say, David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel, and Ze'ev Jabotinsky, both arguing that no, we need a nation state. We need boundaries. We need an army. And Jabotinsky, most notably, is like very violent about it. Now, David Ben-Gurion, he doesn't get a free pass either, but Jabotinsky is particularly like scary. So even within this category of people who are like, no, we need a nation state. We're talking about their variations there too. Non-statists, you have Ahad Ha'am, who's a kind of a 19th century political philosopher of sorts, who argues, no, we need a homeland. We being Jews, obviously have this connection to the land, but we have to live next to the people who live there. It doesn't make sense to go and like take all of it. They also live there. And we need to find a way to live next to these people. A. Martin Buber, being non-statist, is saying, no, Zion is in here. Zion is inside of you. You don't need to look for it out there. Find it inside yourself. That goes a little bit Quaker, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that's right. So Zion is in here, Martin Buber. Hannah Arendt's question is very practical. He's a political philosopher who's saying, post-Holocaust, do we really need a nation state after all the things that have happened to us? Surely we might need some time to think before we jump in to a bordered reality with guns and stuff. Interesting perspective. So, a second point beyond Zionism in the plural is that Jewish Zionism is not religious until 1967. So, Jewishness in these cases is ethnicity and tradition, but it is not a religious tradition. There is this rejection of, this is very 19th century, right? Like you want Christian things, in Europe, you want them kind of abstracted from all the beliefs. Yes, you keep the universalizing principles, but you don't think there's an actual Messiah and flesh and blood, these sorts of things. Very similarly, for these Jews, they want the tradition, they want the ethnic context. They do not want to be understood as participating in the religious context. Theodor Herzl, for instance, thinks Jerusalem is a horrible place and doesn't want anything to do with it. And this kind of vibe continues. Many of the kind of political Zionists until 1967 are not religious. And the idea that Jewish political Zionists would be religious is viewed with disdain. Now, this plays out in that Jewish immigrants to Palestine are seeking to create what they call the new Jew, Hayahud Fadash, or is it Hayahud Hayadash? Anyway, which is to say, the new Jew is somebody who works the land with his hands, right? These are very gendered terms, but working the land with his hands, rejecting these things that portray Jews as frail, there's rejection of tradition insofar as it's religious. And these kind of socialist communes appear in the land of Israel in and around this time, 19th century, early 19th century and onwards. These are kind of the kibbutzim that we're familiar with. If you know anything about the history of this area, there are all these kind of socialist communes that people are farming and these sorts of things. And this is what the new Jew should be doing. The old Jew, being the Jew in Europe, kind of bound by these anti-Semitic laws and so on and so forth. Okay, next slide. This is to say there's lively debate throughout the 19th century, early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, about the nature of Jewish relationship to the land. This debate continues until Nazi Germany forces the issue. Now, Orthodox Jews were anti-Zionist from the get-go. They were like, what do you mean a nation state? The Messiah brings us back. We don't get guns and go. Why would we do that? So the idea that anti-Zionism had just kind of popped out of nowhere does not play out. Again, some of the earliest and most vehement resistors to these Zionist ideologies are themselves Jews, quite early. Next slide, please. In 1917, the British start to meddle, as though they weren't meddling before, but anyway, they're officially meddling now. A British Christian Zionist, Lord Balfour, writes what's called the Balfour Declaration and publicly promises a national home for Jewish people. Wait, hang on a second. That's a typo on my end. A national home for Jewish people in the land. I don't know what happened in that right. Anyway, so post World War I, essentially in 1920, the UK is running Palestine as a colony. It becomes called British Mandate Palestine. This is all happening post Balfour Declaration. So you can start to see in this period there have been several waves of Jewish immigrants to the land. And in that process, we have these kind of increasingly violent Jewish militias, such that if you ever go to Jerusalem, there's a King David Hotel. In this period, the King David Hotel was bombed by Jewish extremists, killing several British officers. But just to highlight the sense that this is not, by no means is this all Jews who would move to the land, but there's a substantive portion of people who want to violently advocate for their own land. At the same time, the British also made promises to Jordanians and other people. Balfour's Declaration was not the only declaration, but it's the one that gets the most press. Next slide. Now, as World War II starts to kind of come onto the scene, the anti-Semitism running throughout Europe at the time makes it clear to Jews globally that they've got to get Jews out of Europe. And people start to do whatever they can to get Jews out of places like Germany, Austria, France, so on and so forth, and to get them other places. The hard part is a lot of people aren't really willing to take as many Jews as there are. If you think about the fact that the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, that's to say that there were at least 6 million people who couldn't find another place to go, either because Nazi legislation prohibited them from moving, or because, as in the case of one kind of very significant story of a boat that gets to New York and is then sent back, they were rejected from these kind of European and or American spaces. Now, Jews do whatever they can to kind of get out as they can, but they can go to Palestine. They can go to British Mandate Palestine. This is an option for them. People there are open to it. Now, post-World War, post-Holocaust, 6 million Jews, European Jews have been murdered, which leaves approximately 3.8 million Jews in Europe. And many of them don't want to stay there. We're talking about displaced peoples who are not where they happened to be before. They need to find a place to go. Next slide, please. Now, a scholar who I respect, Shaul Magid, argues that the State of Israel's establishment in 1948 is a response to this refugee crisis created by World War II, which is to say there are millions of Jews that the West, which is to say Europe, the United States, doesn't want, but they need a place to go. And so the UN establishes the State of Israel in 1948. Now, there are other ways to think about this. There certainly people will talk about this kind of divine agency. Look, God has intervened in space and time. But it's a pretty fraught argument in a lot of ways. I would say this actually makes a good deal of sense. The State of Israel is created as a solution to a refugee problem of global nature. Now, in 1948, there is a war that expels 700,000 Palestinians, which Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And then in the subsequent years, again, kind of what I was talking about in terms of the skipping through history, there are a series of wars between 1948 and 1967. And in 67, the Israelis win a substantive battle that coincides with the rise of right-wing Jewish religious Zionists. Prior to this point, as you may remember, Jewish Zionism, not religious. Here now, suddenly it is. So next slide, please. So we've got this kind of merger of the kind of tenets of political Zionism with religious Judaism in the settler movement. So it starts in Hebron. They're still there. If you Google Hebron settlers, the images will be very disturbing. Do it when the sun's out. Makes it a little bit easier to look at. So the idea here is that all of the lands promised to Palestinians by the UN are up for grabs via this kind of biblical justification of Jewish religious Zionism. So Rabbi Meir Kahane dies in 1990, argues for a theocratic state in like it's very, I mean, he was rejected from political discourse several times in Israel, but nonetheless, this ideology lives on. And that being a very kind of racializing us versus them sort of view. The Palestinian Arabs are in fact the enemy of Jews and Judaism and will always be. And that the land belongs to Jews by means of these divine promises to biblical patriarchs. The line, this kind of summarizes his point. There's this argument that you can hear in a lot of ways, which is Israel is Israel. Right? So the state of Israel is biblical Israel. Now, people don't always spell this out quite so tidily. I'm doing it here in kind of like unedited way to get the point across. But this is essentially the point being made by these religious Zionists. So there's a channeling of promises of land in and through these extremist ideologies and theologies. Next slide, please. Now, this kind of settler movement becomes a increasing part of the Israeli right, political right, through time. And this right continues to gain power, increasingly supported by the United States. The United States, like again, as I said earlier, likes the idea of a buffer against Russian proxy states in the region. Christian Zionists in the United States are very pleased about this. And then here we have Joe Biden from 2022 saying the following: if the state of Israel didn't exist, the U.S. would have to invent it. This is the sort of prevailing ideology from which Joe Biden participated early in his career, but gets to the point of what's going on here. The interplay of Joe Biden, avowed Christian Zionist with respect to the region. Note that he doesn't say, because God gave them the land, Christian Zionism or Joe Biden as Zionist is arguing that it's a political convenience to have the state of Israel where it is. Next slide. This brings us to today's context. So under corruption charges, Benjamin Netanyahu forms his current government with the support of these extremist settlers. And they notably direct policy with respect to the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are both extremist settlers. So you can Google it. It's right there. They are having moved from 67 to these very kind of outlier groups. They are now right there. And their political coalition is actually driving the Netanyahu administration's choices. Because Benjamin Netanyahu is afraid of going to jail, and he can't lose his coalition, these settler voices are now front and center in our political discourse, in the things that we see. Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are like making visits to the United States universities and other things. Rough. So, in this case, I would argue that the distinction between political and religious Zionism in Jewish spaces has largely been lost. I'm not going to say everyone, but it's very the kind of blurring of these two things is now normative, such that if you want to listen to an Ezra Klein's podcast from June of this year, he interviews former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who then references the 2,000 years of biblical promises made to the Jewish people that is manifest in the state of Israel. And this is somebody who can and should know better. But the fact that like this biblical discourse is now part and parcel with the way people talk and think shows a significant movement away from where Jewish Zionism began and its process through time. So, last slide, some takeaways, and then we're going to open the Q&A. I've talked longer than I anticipated. Sorry about that. The Bible does not present a historically accurate portrait of Israel, nor a single portrait of Israel. So the Bible is telling a story for the purposes of creating an identity in space and time. It is not the same as the events described taking place in space and time. 2, the idea that the state of Israel is biblical Israel is very new and problematic. 3, the state of Israel develops as a result of human-made crises and ideological agendas. This is no more divinely instituted than the United States. Now, if you believe the United States is divinely instituted, we have a different problem. But the argument then stands as it is. So that's what I've got for you today. Questions? Next slide. I've got a question. It's just questions. Okay. I mean, so again, we covered like 3,500 years of history, so feel free to take us back to any of it or none of it, but. Or if there are no questions. Yeah,
Yeah, hey, thanks for the big overview.
Yeah, of course.
That's really helpful. And I would agree with you. I don't think that Mark 11,
Yeah.
where Jesus curses the fig tree, says generation will not pass. But that means 40 years after 1948.
Right.
That's when
yeah,
Christ is coming back again.
Yeah.
It's totally,
yeah, yeah.
there's just nothing there in terms of, Christ. Well,
Yeah.
actually, Christ didn't come back in 88.
Yeah.
But then again, 89 reasons why he would come back in 89.
Yeah.
That book didn't sell as well.
No.
A larger question about how politics in Israel is happening
Yeah.
now, and trying to preserve a Jewish state and trying to maintain a
Right.
Jewish majority.
Right.
So welcoming all Jewish people to come in, but not welcoming people to become citizens or residents if they're not Jewish, making that more difficult.
Right.
And also forcing Christians and Druze and Arabs to leave. How does that do with democracy?
No, I mean, it's a solid question. I mean, so the idea of Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel generally is talked about, at least by people who I hear talking about it, in terms of a majority of the population being Jewish and political power. So you can't have, say, the majority of the people being Palestinian or Palestinians running the government and most people being Jews. Neither of those are acceptable to a lot of folks today. How that fits with democracy, I mean, I think democracy is a much more fragile and fraught idea than I had. I grew up in the 90s where everything was like, we won the Cold War, democracy. And yet, as we're seeing now, democracy is quite frail. Democracy it is possible to bend this to your will in one way, shape, or form. And I think what I would say is that the Israeli left crumbled after Yitzhak Rabin's murder in the 90s. And they've never really recovered. And part of the problem, I didn't get into this in the presentation, part of the problem is the Israeli left tended to be Ashkenazi. The Israeli right, over time, have tended to be people who were Ashkenazi meaning from Europe, descended heritage from Europe. Whereas the Israeli right has tended to be what are called Mizrahi, or like people from the East. There's a lot of problems there. But anyway, people who are not from Europe. And then David Ben-Gurion and all these other kind of European founders of the state of Israel treated these people like garbage. They sprayed their grandparents with DDT, and there are all these allegations of stolen children and these sorts of things. Now, I don't know, to what extent this actually happened with stolen children. The DDT did happen. But essentially, there's this kind of deeply ingrained animus in Israeli political discourse, especially from people who are not with European ancestry, towards these kind of Israeli leftists who have European ancestry. And that's played out in some kind of brinkmanship sorts of ways that I think have rendered things quite problematic. I mean, there was an argument early on after the Nakba to have the Palestinians come back, were expelled. That didn't happen. And I think these sorts of decisions kind of precluded some paths forward to a more representative democracy in the region. Got more extremist voices taking the day. I mean, I know that's a rambling answer, but
What's your take on the new peace plan?
I think if anything, my take on it is let's see if it sticks. And then secondarily, shows just how frail the Biden administration's interaction on this issue was. That there could have been a stronger line drawn, that Netanyahu would have listened if there had been any teeth directed to his policies whatsoever. And I mean, if the war ends, that's great, but there's, it's not the end of the suffering of the people of Gaza. It's not the end. Certainly, it's not the end of the military ambitions of the Netanyahu government. So, we'll just see if they pivot from Gaza to somewhere else, or if they'll get the hostages and then they continue. Skeptical. I'll just say skeptical, but as optimistic as I can be for the people of Gaza, start to deserve a break. Let's just put it mildly.
You lived in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
What was your sense living there? Like, because what you presented here
Yeah.
is way more complex and dynamic
Yeah.
in the history than what, well, they exist as the Bible tells you so.
Yeah.
So that's that. End of argument. Like there's two ways of seeing this.
Yeah.
What did you see the presence of that when you lived there? What was it like?
So as with any kind of society, I think, the Pacific Northwest is a good example of this. We don't remember our stories relating to indigenous communities. Like, we know where the reservations are. We don't know why they're there, or at least I never learned that growing up in Washington. I think a very similar sorts of situations takes place in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's very fraught. When I was there would be, I would get on a bus and I would hear like 2 hours later, somebody had driven their car into the bus stop, killed a number of people, I'd get a coffee, and then like 2 hours later, there was drive-by shooting outside the place where I got coffee. So that you're just kind of in this milieu of violence, and directed towards Israelis and Palestinians kind of all the time, because you've got the most extreme kind of spaces in some way in Jerusalem and around the Temple Mount, around the Sharif, right? The kind of this Muslim and Jewish prayer site. As Zionism has become increasingly religious, the religious tension there has become a thing. So those biblical arguments are front and center. In a sense, you have Christian Zionists who I went to class with saying like, oh, the Israelis can do whatever they want to the Palestinians because of the book of Joshua. And I was like, what's that only mean Joshua? Interesting. But the flip side of the story is A, harder to tell, B, takes longer to tell. And I just don't think there's as much political or media appetite for airing the dirty laundry, if that makes sense, or airing the complicated laundry. So what you're seeing now is the process of, I don't know, the last, I left the state of Israel in 2017, finished my degree there, not been back, never will. That, functionally 8 years of thinking about it that produced this and reading about it. Certainly nobody handed me that information while I was there. Yeah.
So how is it that there are people who have risen on the right wing side, and we never hear about the people who may be opposed to them?
Well, so some of it is news outlets. So if you read Haaretz, which is like the kind of like I would say the flagship Israeli newspaper, and like quite a leftist paper, you will hear a lot of those voices in Haaretz. They were coming out early with critiques for Benjamin Netanyahu post October 7th saying Netanyahu's incompetence caused this problem. So those people, they do exist, but there are fewer of them. They tend to be focused in Tel Aviv. The kind of leftist resistance to Netanyahu's government is not a political discourse that American news outlets, British news outlets are particularly interested to portray. Like the BBC and the New York Times are of birds of a feather on this point. You won't get what Haaretz. Haaretz has a lot of things in English as well. If you Google it, it's certainly, if you want to know what's going on from an Israeli perspective, and a reasonable one, I would say Haaretz is the place to look. But this is the problem, right? There's kind of cone of silence directed around certain perspectives that are flagged as authentically Israeli, others that are flagged as inauthentically Israeli. Same story about like when you think of, not me, but like people think about Jewish folks, they're thinking about the ultra Orthodox Haredim with the big, fur hats and wool coats and stuff. Like that's but one expression of Jewishness. It's not the only one. It's not the essentializing one. Do you know what I mean? So I think the same sort of thing happens with political discourse.
Well, I'm surprised that more liberal groups in Europe and the US would not be more balanced.
Yeah, I just think it's easy to essentialize. It's easy to paint with a broad brush. It's hard to get yourself into the compromised space of talking to people whose government does things you don't like. I don't think that is reasonable. I don't think that's the way it should be. But I have a lot of Israeli friends who fundamentally dislike everything post 67. But they don't run the government. So,
Yeah, I get it.
yeah.
Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about Hamas? Where's
Yeah,
is Hamas a Palestinian thing?
yeah,
Or is that
so, no, I mean, so I think obviously in the same story, the same way that like there are and have been through time kind of right-wing extremist Jewish militias, there are Palestinian right-wing militias as well. Hamas, I mean, I would point you towards Jonathan Oliver did a segment on at the beginning of post October 7th. He talks very effectively about Hamas and Netanyahu's government. It's A, really funny, B, really informative, C, quite well balanced. I would point you there for more on it. But Hamas is a representation of Palestinian political discourse, right? In the same way that the IDF functions that way for the Israelis, not in the same way, but analogous to. But I don't think I certainly don't want to reduce all Palestinians to Hamas or, but I think Hamas exists in the world that Israeli political discourse has created, right? It is in some sense a product of the way that the Israeli government has engaged with, in this case, with Gaza and the West Bank. And the fact that Hamas rose to power are choices, I think, that corresponds to things that the Israelis decided with respect to Gaza. Does that help? I don't know. I mean, I told this side of the story because this is the side that I'm more familiar with. The Palestinian side is something I'm still digging into. I could talk about Palestinian Christians much more effectively, but I'm not a scholar of the Middle East in that sense, though I'd like to be.
Hey, Professor, this is Stu Wilketts, zooming in. I lived in Gaza for 4 years. I ran the largest USAID, U.S. government project ever done there, Palestinian Community Assistance Project, which was a 4-year, $100 million community development project. The whole time we did this, we focused on business development with women, small business, provision of water, as is the Israelis had cut off the water supply, computer training for young people, and then allowing them to provide support services internationally because the email pipeline, the internet pipeline goes through the wall and Israel can read all your emails. What I discovered was that the greatest frustration was a future. And as many young people, say under the age of 30, who could depart to get visas to Germany, Europe, Canada, the US, anywhere else, they departed. The other thing I discovered was that when I was in the West Bank, the only time I ever got held hostage was by Israeli settlers. And I found that they are the most committed. Nothing like a new immigrant to be really turned on to the cause. And they declare Aliyah. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
Whereby if you can prove you're Jewish through the mother's side, cannot be through the father, it has to be through the mother, you are allowed to return to Israel, Palestine, and the government will pay your airplane ticket, will pay your initial housing for a year or so, and find you a job. I found that the Israeli Jews, and there are several million Israeli Arabs who never departed Palestine and are not Palestinians. They're Israeli Arabs and they get along fine with the Jews. But I found that the most difficult relationships were with the newest Israeli settlers. And
Yeah.
that conservative element of Netanyahu's political party is the only reason he's still in the position he's in. Now, the new agreement is not a peace agreement, it's a ceasefire. Just like the North Koreans, we've been in a ceasefire with them for how many years? It's not a peace. Um, it's going to be very interesting to see the idea of Hamas will not die. The organization may disappear as we know it, but the idea of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the half a dozen other essential ideas to the Palestinians of Gaza for freedom, for space. It's not that they want a war, they just want opportunity. They want a
Right.
future.
Self-determination, right? You know, it's like
Exactly.
folks being able to say, we get to say what applies to us and how politically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess my it's an unanswerable question is that, in the next 12 months or less should be very interesting as these details are worked out on what this ceasefire means. And the Qataris are so very important in this because they're paying the bills.
Yeah.
Uh, when I was in Gaza, Her Highness the Sheikhs of Qatar funded the total education system, and through the foundation. And the Saudis contributed to water development, and the Egyptians control the exit through Rafah. And that's where all Palestinians come and go in a sense. At the same time, on a daily basis, probably 10,000 Palestinian men went from Gaza into Israel for jobs. And the industries that the Israelis had in the south and even up as far as Tel Aviv could not function without Palestinian workers. So there's a symbiotic relationship, and then there's this conservative, what I consider to be a minority antagonistic stance towards the Palestinians because they're a target, they're easy, they're handy, and there's enough radical Palestinians that shoot things up once in a while to keep that in the top of the headlines. And I guess Reedwood would fit this. I don't know. Mark, what do you think? As fairly conservative evangelical Christian Protestants follow that line that Netanyahu and others pitched, and conservative Christians, that especially in the second coming, and Israel is the promised land, and how it affects we who are Christians in the second coming. And it gets so complicated, I can't figure it out. But all I know is it results in bad actions towards people. Thank you
Yeah.
for your presentation.
Oh, thank you for sharing. I mean, I think you brought up some really good points. I mean, significantly, right? The settler movement, if you should go and ever happen to go into one of these communities, notably fancier than the rest of Jerusalem. Cheaper rent, the visa office much more convenient, air conditioned. I mean, it's like it is built to facilitate more people staying there for longer. So I mean, these are not things that are just ideologically driven, but the ideological conditions create material realities in such that it's kind of a positive feedback loop. You have people who are interested who get there, it's easy to make it work, they like living there, they're around other people, it's easy to stay, easy to get jobs, and then all of a sudden, I mean, you're there. Yeah, and we're out of time, so. Thank you.
Thank you.